When I was a young kid, about 10, 12 years old, I wanted to be a sailor. And as I grew up, I went to the recruiting office in Boston, and it was Navy, Marines, Army, and Coast Guard. And I knew about the Coast Guard because I read up before I joined the service, and I liked the way they operated. It was a small outfit, so I knew I'd be an individual, and the life-saving part about it appealed to me, and the work project that the Coast Guard had. And I liked it better than the Navy because the Navy seemed to be sail on board a warship and you didn't do nothing. The Coast Guard was a working outfit, so that's why I joined the Coast Guard. And I've been satisfied with the Coast Guard all my years, and I loved every duty that I've ever had. In North Africa, I was part of the beach party. The beach party was an officer and a chief and a bunch of us sailors, and we handled the landings and made sure the supplies were forwarded to the Army. And I had landed on a tank. I went in on a tank, on the LCVP, on a tank, and I had a kid with me that I never forgot. And when I hit the beach, I jumped off the tank and I asked the tank driver if he would stop for a couple of seconds to give us a chance to dig a foxhole. And we jumped off the tank and started to dig, and the tank was gone. And it was heavy machine gun fire because it sounded like mosquitoes flying overhead. And I took care of my partner. I thought he was a young kid, but we were the same age, and I watched out for him to try to protect him because I felt that I was more advanced than he was. And on the beach with the Army, it was continued strafing from planes and bombing, and Patton was on the beach, and I was about 5 feet behind him, and I saw his jacket and his pearl-handled gun. I knew who he was because during the strafing attack, we all jumped in foxholes, and he was standing there yelling at us to come back and fight. It was a war. But he never hid. He stood there as if bullets didn't penetrate him. He was the leader of his men, and many times my beach master, Lieutenant Emerson, would have me perform acts that he wanted me to go in town to get supplies or different objects, and he'd tell me what to do and take 2 men with us. And we were dressed like commandos. Well, we had training in Little Creek, Virginia, with the Army and Marines, for 3 months at Little Creek, Virginia, and trained for combat as commandos because we had to protect ourselves at all costs. And we'd go in town armed with our rifles, trusty knives, and the canteens of water. And I had 2 bandoliers of ammunition. I was like a Mexican fighter. And we never thought about any danger because we were under orders to do duties. So I've been through several battles, and I didn't know how bad they were because I always had jobs to do, and my mission was more important than anything else. And after the war, when I read about the battles I was in, it scared me because I didn't believe that I was in any danger. And it seems like there was more danger than I thought. But we were, all combat troops do the same thing. They have missions to accomplish, and they do what they have to do. They don't think of danger or any firing. I don't remember being fired upon, but I accomplished whatever I was asked to do. In Sicily, the next invasion was the invasion of Sicily. We were left Norfolk sometime in June, and we arrived at Marcel Kabir, and later went to Oran, and we were prepared for landings, and the ship went through a minefield, and the ship, we had paravanes that were deployed on the bow of the ship to cut mines as we went through the minefield. And we had sharpshooters aboard ship to try to explode them before we got to them. And the passage was pretty well swept by minesweepers before we got there, so wasn't too many mines left. And when we went to southern Sicily, there was about 400 ships, and the landing was fairly easy, light gunfire. German tanks were on the beach, and they provided most of the gunfire that was over there. And we were under constant strafing and bombing by German Stuka dive bombers. The Stuka made a weird noise when it was flying, so we knew the kind of fighter planes that were up there. And at night, the landing was on July 10th, and the night of the 11th. We were under attack for about 3 hours, severe bombing and strafing, and a lot of near misses. with bombs that blinded us aboard ship from the flashing of the bombs going off. And we were shooting down a lot of planes and never knew what they were. Later, about 6 months later, we found out that paratroop planes were shot down. 23 paratroop planes, 430 personnel were killed from the 82nd Airborne Division. We never knew about it. I never understood why they flew over when we were under bomb attack and all guns were firing a barrage in the sky, and the whole sky was lit up with the bombing. I don't know why, because I believe the colonel or whatever was in charge of that flight saw that we were under attack and could have diverted the planes, because there was nothing we could do except fire, and we didn't know what was up in the sky. So it wasn't the sailors, it was an error on the Air Corps, I always believe. After Sicily, we went to North Africa and picked up 750 Africa Corps and Hermann Goring Division men as prisoners of war and took them back to the States and landed in Norfolk. And I believe we stayed in Norfolk for a week or two. And then we had orders to proceed to the Pacific. And we went through the Panama Canal. It was a beautiful sightseeing trip. And we went up to San Francisco and loaded troops and took them to Hawaii and unloaded new troops there. And then we'd have landing operations on the island of Maui, and we load Marines, soldiers, Army men to land over there and practice landing. And then we got orders. We were going on a mission and went to Gilbert Islands, Tarawa, and Macon. And our mission was Macon Island, and we had a fairly easy landing there. There was quite a few Japs there, but they were wiped out pretty easy for the bombardment. We always had heavy bombardment whenever we went to the Pacific. We always had at least 4 battleships, 4 or 5 cruisers, and up to 20 destroyers. And they would, and 4 aircraft carriers, and they would bombard the beaches. We couldn't see how anybody could survive, but some of them did. And the aircraft carrier St. Lo was torpedoed, and we picked up the survivors from the St. Lo and took them to Pearl Harbor. And that's when Admiral Nimitz, who was the fleet admiral of the Pacific Ocean at the time, came aboard ship, and they played the Coast Guard song while he was walking, and he wanted to know what they were playing. And sliding down the ladder coming off my gun turret, I almost stepped on his feet sliding down the ladders. And I said, whoops. And I just walked around. I didn't recognize him. He was smaller than me. So I just walked around him and kept on going to get my sleep. And after that, we loaded up Marines and went to Marshall Island. And the Marshalls, we had several invasions: Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Roy, and Namur. They were all atolls in the Marshall Islands, and we had to land the Marines at each atoll to clear them up. And many casualties came back to the ship, and we were a hostile ship. We had a team of 8 doctors, full teams, their nurses, male nurses, and we were the #1 hostile ship off the beach. And we'd take care of the casualties. And the casualties, we'd raise the landing barges, LCVPs, to the boat deck and take off the survivors. And it was horrible to see how badly wounded these men were. Some legs were missing, arms were missing. The worst casualties were the chest and stomach ones. We'd give them a cigarette, and they all had the M on their forehead, and they'd line them up on deck, and the doctors would come out and take the worst casualties there were. And they only lost 2 men on all of casualties that we had in the Pacific. And we had burial at sea, and there was a famous picture that came out with the burial off the Leonard Wood. And after that, we went back to Pearl Harbor, had a rest, and then loaded on Marines again. And our next invasion was Saipan. And we didn't know where we were going till listening to Tokyo Rose on the radio telling us the Leonard Wood, what troops we had aboard ship, the 22nd Marines, and where we were going. They said Saipan. We had no idea where it was, but the next day, the officers opened up the orders and told us we were going to Saipan. And Saipan was heavily bombed and strafed, and that was the Great Turkey Shoot. The Japanese had 4 carriers there. They launched all the planes, and they left the area. And the Japanese pilots, I believe Japan lost most of their experienced pilots at Saipan because they were left to fall in the ocean or crash on ships, whatever. They were shot down by our pilots, most of them. But the beach landing was very fierce. There was 20,000 Japs on the island, and most of them were killed. They charged into heavy fire of Marines. They had cannons, machine guns, and the Japs would just run into it, and it was like a suicide battle. And Marines didn't want sailors on the beach because they were in their way, in troubles. I was assigned to an anti-aircraft gun and relief crews for landing barges because the crews would be tired of driving back and forth to the. You couldn't go to the beach to deliver supplies. You had to transfer the goods onto marine alligators, half tracks, the tracked vehicles that could go up to the beach. The landing barges couldn't make it because there was rocks all around, and you had the ships at night at 3 or 4 o'clock. They'd leave the transport area and just go out to sea because they didn't want to be targets for submarines. And the LCVPs were stuck to go back and forth on offshore with the supplies on it. And we had to watch out for Japanese that would swim out the landing barges and throw grenades in landing barges. So we stayed far enough offshore and wake. We had to keep awake all night to make sure that nobody came near us. My duties were anti-aircraft gun, most invasions, because I was on the bridge, anti-aircraft gun, and I remember one invasion that I shot at a Japanese plane that I thought was going to crash on the ship, and I could see my bullets from the 20 millimeter exploding on the Japanese plane, but I was given punishment for open firing because we were not supposed to fire when we had air cover. And when I was told to stop firing and clean my gun, and P-38s were chasing the Japanese planes, but they had to watch out for silly people like myself that opened fire without orders. I read about the invasion of the Philippines, the Battle of Leyte, and that was the world's largest sea battle that they ever had. These and destroyers were the only ships that protected us, and Taffy 3 was 3 Jeep carriers that Japanese had sunk right off the bat, and they sunk all the VEs and destroyers attacking them. And the transport, we slipped our chains and got out of there as fast as we could because we had no idea what the Japs were going to do. But I read about it after the war. The Japanese admiral in charge of the fleet is the only one that said, let's go home. We did enough damage. We cannot stop this invasion. And all our troops and MacArthur, and we were in a landing when MacArthur came ashore, and we sort of laughed at it because the landing by the LCVP that had him aboard hit the beach. Photographers jumped out and they set up their cameras on the beach. And when MacArthur came in, the cameras kept rolling. That was after the beach was secure. And that's when he said, I have returned. We had one more invasion in the Philippines, Lingayen Gulf, and then we went to U.S.C.G Atoll, and we had Marines aboard for the next landing, and the boiler blew up, and Leonard Wood was done with invasions because we could not keep up to the invasion fleet. At Saipan, we thought the name of the town was a beautiful name, Sharon-Kanoa. That was the capital, and they had a big smokestack sitting, standing on that Sharon-Kanoa, and that's where a Japanese was on top of that smokestack and directing the fire that he had till the Marines knocked down the smokestack. And after the Japanese troops suffered heavy casualties, their families and the rest of their Japanese got on cliffs facing the invasion fleet, and we could see groups of women and children with their Japanese jumping off a cliff. And it was sad to see bodies all over the beach and the rocks below, and most of them died. The Japanese were fearful of the Marines. The Marines scared the Japanese more than the war did. Most of my chiefs, petty officers, watched out for me because I was a good sailor, but I was a troublemaker. So they used to protect me, told me to keep my mouth shut, but all officers and chief petty officers I had over me throughout my career helped me tremendously and made me a top chief when I got there, because I was treated great by all officers and petty officers in charge of me throughout my career. I learned how to do that when I was on Hank's Shift flight ship in Vineyard Sound in 1947. The skipper of the lightship was building ships and bottles, and I was watching them, and I always wanted to do something like that, and I always remembered doing it. I did it from watching him in the 90s. My wife asked me about ships and bottles, and I started making them, and I've made over 400 of them. About 5 admirals in the Coast Guard I made them for, and they were all very nice people. And I made one for the Coast Guard Academy, the museum, and it was on loan to the Smithsonian for 2 years, and is on display in the Smithsonian in Washington for 2 years. And I called them up and I asked them if they could send me a picture of them on display, and they did. They sent me some pictures of they were the Coast Guard Cutter Eagle in a gallon bottle, and I've made copies of different ships in bottles. The Eagle, the Constitution, and German ships. Germans seem to make a lot of top sailing ships for academies around the world. Just serving as a chief petty officer, I was in charge of a cutter, the 82-foot cutter, Point Cypress, and I went to Miami during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I took the 82 from Boston and went down to Miami and stayed there for a few months. And even now, the Coast Guard seems to honor me with meetings, and I've met the commandants of the Coast Guard, 2 of them in Boston, and I've met top officers, captains, commanders, and they read my profile and they honor me as a World War II veteran. As far as I'm concerned, I'm being honored now for present people in the Coast Guard that seem to want to know about the old Coast Guard. I'm an old Coast Guardsman.